Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening to those joining us from Asia, and good morning to everyone joining us from Europe. I'm Michael Lawrence. Welcome to today's program, India's Turning Point, an economic agenda to spur growth and jobs. Asia House is pleased to be producing today's event in partnership with McKinsey Global Institute. And today's discussion will focus on an extensive report by McKinsey Global Institute, which looks at India's economic prospects over the next decade and what it must do to seize the opportunities presented by emerging global trends. Those trends include the rapid progress in automation and artificial intelligence, the shift in global value chains, and increasing efforts to combat climate change. Of course, India has been very hard hit by the pandemic, with infection and death rates among the worst in the world. The pandemic has had a devastating impact on the economy, which was already struggling with decade-low growth. GDP collapsed 23.9% in the period April to June. Well, according to the McKinsey report, India needs to create at least 90 million non-farm jobs by 2030, and that will require GDP growth of some 8 to 8.5% every year from 2023 to 2030. In a few moments, I'll invite Anu Madgavkar, who's partner at McKinsey Global Institute, to brief us on the report, after which we'll be joined by two distinguished speakers for what promises to be a lively panel discussion. But first, just a couple of findings which struck me. The global trends I mentioned earlier could contribute $22.5 trillion of economic value to India and support 30% of non-farm jobs in 2030. The creation of these opportunities depends on having reforms in place to raise productivity and competitiveness, and financial system reforms to generate the necessary capital. And India's corporate sector will also need to evolve. India must address its missing middle of firms and enable many more to climb the ladder of scale and competitiveness. And finally, both central and state governments will have a critical role to play to execute this ambitious reform agenda. So much to discuss. Let's get more detail now on the report, and it's my great pleasure to welcome back to Asia House Anu Madgavkar, partner, McKinsey Global Institute, who isn't at Asia House, but is joining us virtually today from Mumbai. Anu, great to see you again. Please brief us on the report.
Thanks so much, Michael, and many thanks to Asia House, and a warm welcome to everyone who's dialed in for today's discussion. Let me, in true McKinsey fashion, put up my slides, and that will help, I think, bring this report to life for you. So I think just stepping back in terms of the context of why we did this report, some of you or many of you might know that McKinsey Global Institute is the economics research arm of McKinsey & Company, and we do a small and select but fairly in-depth set of research efforts every year. And the only sort of mandate or guiding principle about what we choose is that it should be, amongst the most important opportunities and topics of its times. And as we thought about this roughly a year ago, when we were thinking about work that we wanted to do on India, it was clear that reigniting growth, economic growth, was actually, the most critical issue for India, really, as it thought about its future into the next decade. Now, the history is that, earlier when we had studied emerging markets across maybe 70 to 80 countries around the world, we had indeed found that not more than a dozen or so were really the long-term outperformers amongst emerging economies, which had in a sustained way over long periods of time, maybe 20 years or maybe 3 or 4 decades in some cases, but had in a very sustained way driven up growth in per capita GDP and substantially improved sort of the lot of millions of people and narrowed the gap between their per capita income and the rest of the advanced world. India was one of those half a dozen countries. And in order to sort of sustain its place there and continue making progress on that front, it felt very important to reverse some of the more recent challenges and slowdowns that we had observed, which included a pattern of very slow job growth, as well as challenges on the external sector in terms of exports to GDP actually slowing down significantly in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. And then, of course, a banking buildup of non-performing assets, which led to strains of its own kind. So we started this work earlier, and then, of course, COVID happened. And as COVID happened, I think this is really an additional and urgent piece of context. So there always was the longer term call to action to drive growth, but this more immediate crisis in which we and many other parts of the world find ourselves is providing obviously added impetus to this. For those who aren't familiar, the economy, as Michael said, has contracted in the first quarter of our fiscal year by over 20%, 23.9% contraction. And according to most analysts and observers, for the whole year, the contraction is likely to be in the range of 9 to 12%. So it is likely to be on the higher side, even relative to many other economies. We have had health challenges, though things are looking at an all India level somewhat better in the last few weeks. But there are issues in terms of some of the real indicators. We've obviously seen unemployment spiking up and a potential addition to non-performing assets as a result of COVID strain on much of the mid-market in particular. So with this context, we as India need to look forward. So we need, of course, policies to help us tackle the crisis now, but also look forward to the next decade because of the potential rise of job seekers who will want to find work, typically not in the farm or agricultural sector. We will need 90 million incremental work opportunities in the non-farm sector, and this is roughly triple the rate of growth of jobs that India has actually been managing to achieve, let's say, in the last 5 or 6 years before the crisis. So 3 times the job creation rate. And to make these jobs gainful, productive, and remunerative for workers, that really does imply an 8 to 8.5% annual GDP growth based on our estimates. And this is roughly double the pre-COVID growth. So even ignoring the deep trough and recovery this year, the pre-COVID growth had hit a low of 4.2%. So this would be roughly double that rate of growth that we need to hit in the COVID recovery phase and FY23 to 30. Now, is this possible? Is this feasible? To frame that, we sort of looked back at the last 2 decades. And what we found is that GDP growth, as we think about it, is really the sum total of two components: the rate at which an economy grows its employment and the rate at which productivity or output per worker, labor productivity actually rises. And if you look back 2 decades at India's history, we have actually in the first decade of the 21st century achieved about 1.5% job growth or employment growth, whereas the second decade roughly achieved 7% productivity growth. So what we really need, what the 8 to 8.5 growth really needs, is to achieve the best of the last 2 decades, the highest rate of job creation combined with the highest productivity growth rate. Possible, but significantly, ambitious as well at some level. The other part about the quality and the sort of drivers of growth going forward is when we looked at it in terms of sectors, what we found is that India's growth has traditionally actually been more in the services sectors. Knowledge intensive services and even labor intensive services have traditionally done well. But the slump in manufacturing and construction are things that need to be urgently addressed as part of this high growth agenda. We think that the manufacturing sector still poses significant opportunities for India. Perhaps this is the last real decade where labor-intensive manufacturing can actually come to India in larger share. But we think that there's potential for manufacturing to drive about 1/5 of the incremental GDP that India needs. Whereas the construction sector is actually critical as a transition to really absorb labor that comes out of the farm sector. So 1 in 4 of the incremental jobs that we need in the non-farm sector can actually come from construction. So while all sectors are important, manufacturing and construction need an added thrust in order to reverse the trend of the last 5 or 6 years and bring them back up to higher growth. So, what's needed in order to achieve this? The report really talks about four big components. The first is to build and enable and unlock a set of frontier businesses. We call them frontier businesses because they are more productive than other businesses. In that sense, they're closer to the productivity frontier, 2.5 to 3 times more productive on average. And a set of these combined can generate about $2.5 trillion of economic value or GDP by 2030 if driven to their full potential. So that's really one piece. The second piece is about the entities that will build these businesses, which is really India's corporate sector. And here we emphasize the importance of scale and competitiveness in the corporate sector and point out the need and the potential to have 1,000 more mid-sized companies scaling up to become large companies. Similarly, 10,000 more small companies scaling to mid. So really helping firms climb this ladder of scale. That's the second point. The third pillar is about the scale and speed of reforms. There are a lot of reforms in a lot of areas. We focused on six critical areas, but really want to emphasize that what's needed is that these are addressed and rolled out and implemented with a terrific sense of urgency, which has been possible for India to do over different points in its history, right? And we're seeing some evidence of that happening now as well. And the fourth pillar is really financing the growth, where we think that both across the banking and capital markets, $2.4 trillion of capital will be required for growth, which is 3 times today's level by 2030. And it will be required in a different mix and at lower cost. So a set of reforms around the financial sector are critical to unlock these. Let me quickly give you a flavor for some of the specifics under the four pillars. The first is around the frontier businesses. We looked across all sectors. We considered some of these global trends, which are in many ways being accelerated by COVID. And we came down to 43 business opportunities and grouped them under these three themes. Global hubs where India can serve demand for itself and the world. Efficiency engines where India can build businesses that create value but also unlock efficiency and competitiveness in the rest of the economy. And then finally, new ways in which India's people can actually live, work, interact, trade, and so on with each other. And each of these adds up to about 50% of the incremental growth and 30% of the incremental non-farm jobs that India will need. Here we present just a very quick snapshot of the 43. There are, each of the points on the page are one of the business opportunities. The report has more in depth about each of these. And the numbers that you see are our estimates of, if unleashed, what the potential GDP or economic contribution of these various business opportunities could be by 2030. A couple to call out. The first row is really about the global hubs, but the global manufacturing hubs are about $450 billion in terms of potential value, roughly the same, about 400 billion in terms of potential exports. The high value agricultural ecosystems are very interesting. Again, 100 billion in terms of potential exports, an interesting mix of both production, processing, and the whole services ecosystem around agriculture. In terms of the efficiency engines, I think some important ones to call out might be within financial services, a whole business opportunity around what we call flow-based lending, which is really data-driven credit underwriting, leveraging the huge data and digital revolution that's sweeping India, like many other emerging markets. So how can you use that data to provide credit to micro and small enterprises? Create value in of itself as a business, profitable business, but then also make these enterprises more productive. Similarly, high efficiency, the number 9 that you see there, the high efficiency power and logistics are business models that can reduce power and logistics cost by 20 to 25% in our estimate, and thereby also unlock a lot of competitiveness. And in the last row, there are both physical spaces for India that can be significantly improved, whether it's through better urban infrastructure or climate change mitigation, or indeed a set of digital enabled opportunities and ideas around digitized job matching platforms, skills and education platforms, and of course, retail and e-commerce. So put together, this is a big opportunity, but begs the question, who's actually going to go in there and invest and innovate in order to build these out? And that brings us to India's firms. And when we looked at our large set of, outperforming emerging economies, or rather the small set of about a dozen that had sustainably outperformed, we found that the one feature they had in common was a large and a rising share of firms that had the threshold that we used was $500 million of annual revenue. So we called a firm that was 500 million plus a large firm. And the share of large firms' revenue to GDP, so their scale and scope, was significantly higher in many of these outperforming emerging markets. So India has about 600 such firms today, and they are much more productive, 10 to 11 times more productive than the overall economy, but they account for about 48% of GDP. And there is scope for their, the extent to which they impact the economy to rise to about 74%, which is the benchmark that we've seen in the other high growth Asian economies in particular. And for this cohort of large firms to grow in scale and scope, you really need to think about the pyramid below it. The mid-sized firms, 40 million to 500 million in revenue, and the smaller firms, of course. And we find that it's the mid-sized firms for which India has fewest relative to other countries, even adjusted for its size of GDP. So we have a missing middle in terms of not enough mid-sized firms and therefore not enough large firms. So enabling companies to climb this ladder, as I said, is actually quite critical. And they have been hindered in this because of barriers, both in terms of the capital that they're able to raise, as well as barriers in terms of the operating environment. So the reform pillars we'll talk about shortly will address, both these sets of barriers. In terms of the operating environment, there are a lot of reforms that a country like India can actually pursue. We tried to avoid a laundry list, but we did zoom into six that we think are most critical, or six areas. There are a set of sector-specific growth policies which involve well thought through incentives, perhaps, thinking about tax and tariff structures in a thoughtful way across 5 or 6 sectors. Land and labor markets do come back. We can talk about this later in the discussion. I won't spend time now, but reducing the cost of land and making labor markets both more flexible, but also helping create more opportunities for labor by boosting their mobility across occupations, across locations, so that it's easier to find the job that you need. Efficient power distribution, which I already talked about. A lot of this is around privatization and franchisee-based models for power distribution, the last end of the chain, which still needs to be reformed. And then looking at the SOEs and potentially privatizing and generating through SOE as well as asset sales about close to $500 billion in proceeds over the next 10 years or so. And then reducing compliances and improving ease of doing business. Much has been done here, but much more needs to be done on the ground. The good news is that in this list, we reckon that about half of these reforms don't involve lengthy, complicated implementation on the ground, but are more about policies and laws that can be framed or enacted uh, relatively easily. So that's, I think, the good news on the reform front. The last piece is around financing. As I said, 2.4 trillion in 2030, which is roughly 3 times what India was investing prior to COVID. But the three big components here, there is a capital markets set of reforms which are critical because the mid and small companies we talked about are actually squeezed in terms of their ability to raise long-term risk capital. And so across all of the capital markets uh, instruments, we've basically seen that about the share of household savings that flows into instruments like mutual funds, insurance, pensions, etc., needs to rise from 7 to 11%, and we need the right incentives to make that happen. The banking system is intermediating credit at high cost. The average Indian commercial borrower pays about 5 percentage points more than the equivalent or the company similar in other countries. And a large part of this is the credit costs which are passed on due to the overhang of non-performing loans. So we do need a surgical intervention to take care of that, as well as the operating expense burden. And finally, public finances do need to be streamlined. Structurally, roughly half of India's savings flow to the government to finance its expenditure, its programs, or its directed lending sectors. And only half is left for the commercial sector. So we need an agenda here, and it's possible to actually raise 3.5% of GDP and take care of additional expenses, but also have enough to just step back and reduce this crowding out, which India is structurally faced with. The last idea I'd like to leave before we get into the discussion is really the how to make it happen, which in many ways is the most important question. At some level, the what is reasonably clear, except for the detail, of course. But in terms of the how to make it happen, we emphasize that we need to fire reforms on two fronts, state-led and center-led in our federal structure. And roughly 60% of what needs to be done is actually within the control of the states. So that's a mixed blessing. Not all states will reform at the same pace. At the same time, a few states reforming can significantly change the mood and raise competition with the rest of the states. So that's on the two engines. Rapid implementation, I've already talked about. And then a center and state architecture. We've been inspired by a few effective things that the government has done when it's really wanted to drive a mission, like the Swachh Bharat mission, which was the sanitation mission of India, for example, or the Pragati style reviews, which the Prime Minister did to debottleneck infrastructure projects. So things can move with the right architecture, and similar architecture or systems can be set up for chief ministers at the state level too. But that's going to be quite critical. And we do have a window, I think, of 6 to 12 months in order to push much of this through. And that period will be decisive. So I close with the thought that it is a leadership moment. The next 6 to 12 months are going to be quite critical. And there are imperatives both for government, of course, to make economic reforms the topmost priority, but also for CEOs to embrace some of the frontier businesses we talked about and really put talent and capital behind them. So let me stop here, and I look forward to the questions as well as the discussion with the panel. Thank you.
Anu, thank you very much indeed. A very comprehensive report and a very ambitious outlook for India. So let's now move on to the panel discussion. I'm delighted to be joined by Amitabh Kant, who's CEO of the National Institution for Transforming India, NITI, who joins us from Delhi, and James Crabtree, Associate Professor of Practice, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, who is with us today from Singapore. Thank you both very much for being with us. Amitabh, I'd like to start with you. The MGI report urges substantial transformation. Just heard a briefing there. We're talking about, I believe Anu put it as India achieving the best of the best from the last 2 decades. Is it realistic?
Well, I'm quite hopeful because despite a record contraction, GDP growth in India is bouncing back and is expected to rebound sharply. We need to sustain this momentum in order to usher in a long-term sustained growth, and integrating ourselves in global supply chains, achieving size and scale in manufacturing, adoption of technology across all spheres will, I think, to my mind, be the key enablers of India's growth story going forward. But one of the key things is that India has used this crisis also as an opportunity to usher in some very radical reforms, many of whom were pending for a long period of time. We've brought in huge reforms in the agriculture sector. We've done away with the agriculture produce marketing control order, which ensured that the farmers could only sell in the local mandi. Now they can sell anywhere. We've modified the Essential Commodities Act. We've allowed contract farming now to take place. We've demonopolized coal. We've liberalized the mineral industry. We've taken this opportunity to redefine the medium and small enterprises. And from about close to 44 odd laws, we've brought in just 4 labor codes. So these, to my mind, are really historic reforms in many, many ways. Many of them will bring in competition, transparency, and bring in private sector uh, into the Indian growth story in a much bigger way. We are also pushing for infrastructure creation given a huge impetus to infrastructure creation. We've built up the national infrastructure pipeline, which envisages US dollar 1.5 trillion worth of investments. A huge push has been given to asset monetization, which will give robust long-term and stable investment opportunities. We've privatized a number of airports. We pushed for selling of roads and highways, and we'll go ahead with gas pipelines, power grids, etc. So we've identified 11 asset classes for monetization, including a range of power lines, highways, ports, and non-core PSUs. All these are areas which are critical to bring in long-term enhancement of efficiency and bringing in greater productivity. We also are great believers that if India is to grow at high rates over a long period of time, FDI will play a major role, and therefore the FDI regime has been liberalized. And actually, during the COVID period, India is probably one of the few countries in the world which has attracted $38 billion worth of investments. And our objective will be to keep opening up. I think FDI regime has been very, very heavily liberalized, and we will continue to push for greater improvement in procedures. And our focus in the last 4 to 5 years before the COVID was essentially to make India very easy and simple. So India jumped up about 79 positions in the World Bank Ease of Doing Business. But the important thing is that we started ranking our states. So we rank states, and first year we did this. Gujarat came number 1. Next year, Andhra beat Gujarat, and the third year, Telangana beat all of them. So there's been heavy competition among states, and we've believed in a policy of naming and shaming them. So we've seen a huge improvement in ease of doing of business amongst the states. I think the other big focus has been the digitization of the Indian economy and using technology to really leapfrog. So we are the only country with 1 billion biometric, 1 billion bank account, 1 billion plus mobiles, and there's been a huge push towards direct benefit transfer to the beneficiaries. So over 500 schemes, we release funds directly into the bank accounts, and this has brought in immense efficiency. We push for digital payment through the unified payment interface, which connects over about 200 banks in India. The digital payment has seen a huge impetus, and the new health insurance scheme, which covers over 500 million Indians, is all cashless and paperless and digital, and so is the goods and services tax, which is totally digital. So digitization has been the key driver of India's story, and I think it will be critical as we go along because it will throw up an enormous amount of data. Having said all this, I think the challenge, to my mind, really for India is, as Anu had said, is really to attract, firstly, to become far more easier and simpler as far as states are concerned. There's a huge challenge before the states to become easy and simple. That's number one. Number two, a lot of the growth story really lies with the states, and India needs to create about close to about 10 states, which will be really the champion states of India driving growth. And if they grow at high rates over a sustained basis of over a long period, India will grow in a big way. And the third key challenge to my mind is making India an integral part of the global supply chain. And this would require radical reforms in 2 areas. One is logistics. The cost of logistics in India is still high. A lot of process of digitization is taking place, and therefore the cost of logistics must fall. And secondly, the cost of power because India is among the few countries where the cost of power to the manufacturing units is actually higher than the cost of power to the residential units. So the discoms need to be privatized, which is one of the ambitions of this government, is to privatize discoms, which they're doing in the union territories right now, is to push for that. And this would require some great degree of political will to do this. But logistics and reducing the cost of power will be very, very critical as we go along.
Amitabh, thanks very much. I want to bring in James Crabtree now. Clearly, James, one from outside would say very sensible reform program been suggested in the report. Amitabh seemed to suggest some reforms along those lines that would make a lot of sense. But you need political will. How realistic is it that these reforms, especially in the post-pandemic world, can be implemented?
Thank you for that, and thank you very much for hosting. Congrats to Anu and McKinsey for this report. And hi, Amitabh. Hope you're doing well. You seem like you're full of beans.
Yeah,
I think I found myself sort of more optimistic than I thought I was going to be reading this report, because I think maybe the headline figure feels a bit otherworldly in the aftermath of the pandemic, because, let's not kid ourselves. There's absolutely no chance that India is going to grow at 8.5% on average by 2030. I can't see any conceivable way that that can happen. It never grew at that rate prior to the crisis. And so to get to that average from this kind of start seems to me impossible. That said, there's no reason to kind of talk the country down. The pandemic is very tough, as it is in the UK and everywhere else. But you should be planning on the best possible response and with the best possible ideas, and the kind of ideas that Anu and colleagues have suggested. In a funny way, they seem very familiar. The reform part of the report, in a sense, it shows that India, there is a playbook out there. This has always been the case with India, that by virtue of coming relatively late to this process, other countries have been through here before. We sort of know what works, and so that's a very positive thing. And so you have a kind of template there, and it's a very similar template to the one that I would have talked about when I lived in India. And it's very good to hear Amitabh sort of talking about the urgency of this reform. I suppose that the problem is to get into some of the politics of this, and we can probably dive into this in much greater depth, that, this is not a great place to start from, because although the Modi government remains extraordinarily popular, the pandemic is going to require some really difficult choices in terms of, investment, stimulus, in order to kind of get through this. But equally, there are some ways, and it'd be interesting to hear from Amitabh about this, in which the government appears to be going away from the direction that is suggested in this report on, for instance, its self-reliance program, on the direction in tariffs, the decision not to go for something like entry into the RCEP trade agreement. And so the focus on the importance still of export-focused manufacturing, I think that it's really important, and India does have an opportunity, and we can talk more about the fact that it is an opportunity that, although globalization is not heading in the direction that India would like, given that having a kind of thriving global economy would help India, geopolitics does at the moment present some opportunities. The relationships between the US and China and the West and Southeast Asia could be catalytic in the same way that some of these more bottom-up domestic reforms could be, but they're unlikely to be so if India begins to kind of close itself off from the world and become pessimistic, as Arvind Subramanian has argued recently, and when he talked about the new export pessimism, become more self-reliant, more inward-looking. That's not the direction that Anu is suggesting, and so I think there's a danger here that the politics of the pandemic and the kind of tone of the international system may have the temptation to take India away from the kind of policy mix that is most likely to give it the best possible chance of kind of rebounding from this pandemic and then getting on to the kind of high growth trajectory that it needs to achieve the job creation that, its young population coming off the farms and into other kinds of employment needs. So I think that's a kind of tension. And then there's lots more to say about all of this, Michael, but back to you.
No, thanks. So let me put that to you, Anu. James just very eloquently outlined the political challenges, the geopolitical environment, and the fact that India may be shifting away from the sorts of recommendations that you've made in this report due to that, and also, you know, obviously the aftermath of the pandemic and the crisis that India and the rest of the world faces. Have you taken that into account? Is that a risk that has grown? You started thinking about this report before the pandemic. You've written it through the pandemic. Is that now a greater risk to achieving the sorts of things that you've suggested in this report?
I think that's a great question. I'll come to it in a second. I just wanted to clarify one small point that James made, which is, James, you're right in saying that that headline number is not achievable for the decade or starting from where we are today. And that's not what we suggest. What we do suggest is that even if growth is, or GDP is actually flat over a 2-year period because of the pandemic, i.e. there's a trough and then a recovery and you're back to where you were pre in terms of overall GDP. From that point on, you really need to hit this high trajectory or higher growth rate of 8 to 8.5%. For the decade, it would be lower. And we do, by the way, also outline an alternative scenario, which we hope we don't actually get there, but in the alternative scenario, we're not able to hit that high path. And what we end up for the decade is really about 5.5% growth, which we would all agree is actually, very disappointing for a country like India, just given its demographics and what it's aspiring to do. So that said, I think coming back to the really important question that James asked about, how does the crisis change things, right, Michael, that you talked about? I think in some ways, in a strange way, and Amitabh should react and clarify more, but in some ways, a crisis of this kind has enabled more focus on at least some areas of reform, including, to me, what are personally surprising as what I would have thought politically difficult areas to touch, right? And the agricultural sector is a great example. If I had to put my money behind a set of reforms that I thought the government would, a set of bold reforms that the government would do at this time, I don't think I would have put my money on the agricultural sector, right? Just because of the poverty, the rural dependence on agriculture, the entrenched interests, it's a state-driven subject. The central government actually found a way, right? And we would have to work that through the states and get states on board to embrace it. But at least the new laws are out there and they're taking on a subject that is politically very, very challenging, or has been for successive regimes in the past. So I draw some hope from that to say that maybe there are parts of this reform agenda which are truly win-win in the eyes of the government, saying this will benefit their constituency, which is actually a large number of, income seekers, job seekers, and so on. So is there a win-win? Clearly, in the government's mind, the agricultural reforms were in that bucket, that it would actually benefit farmers to remove some of this and tackle some of the other vested interests that had come in the way, right, with the old laws. So that has actually happened. The other comment that I would make is that on the self-reliance approach, so James is absolutely right in saying that self-reliance and being inward-looking is not what we advocate as being essential as part of this report. It's very much an external and globally oriented mindset that India needs to have, adapting to its own unique, capabilities at the same time. But export-led manufacturing growth is a big piece of this. So James is absolutely right. I think in the details of how that pans out, we do think that when we looked at some of the other fast growth economies and looked back at their history, there were periods of time where incentives of some kind, some shape or the other, fiscal incentives, foreign exchange licenses, concessional credit, there were state-supported incentives provided to many of these industries in their growth phase. But what was unique or different about those models versus India is that this support was typically time-bound and conditional. So it wasn't support forever, it was support contingent on achieving productivity, achieving exports, achieving patents or R&D improvements, after which you don't really need the incentives, right? So I see the self-reliance sort of maybe as a wrap around a core idea. At least in the handset manufacturing space, we've seen this mindset kicking in with the government and being put in place in a policy as well, which says we understand that there is a maybe 10 to 15% cost differential for manufacturing handsets in India versus other countries. We're willing to kind of have a policy that helps bridge that gap. But then we would expect domestic production as well as exports to rise consistent with expectations. And we perhaps need more of that, guarding always against not making it conditional and time bound. Easier said than done, but I think that's a bit of a nuance on self-reliance versus being export driven or externally oriented.
Okay, thanks. Now, we're very keen to take questions from you, from the audience. If you'd like to ask a question, please just let me know via the chat function on Zoom, and I'll bring you in very, very shortly. We already have a few people who are queuing up to ask questions. But before I go to the audience, Amitabh, I want to come to you. You've spoken before about AI, and you spoke about the digital future of India. Is this one of the keys to unlocking the sort of growth that Anu and McKinsey have suggested in this report?
One of the for India growing on a sustained basis for long periods of time. How do you use technology to leapfrog and make India a far more efficient and productivity-oriented country? But there are many others, and I think, to my mind, making India a we moved away straight from agriculture into the services sector. We skipped the manufacturing. But for a country of India's size and scale, it's not possible to provide jobs without pushing for manufacturing in a big way. And therefore, doing efficient manufacturing in key sectors of growth is very important. Secondly, I think important to get into some sunrise areas of growth. What Anu talked about as frontier sectors is very critical. And one of which, to my mind, would be artificial intelligence, but 5G, electric mobility, genomics, data storage, all these are critical to get into, because if you don't get into the sunrise areas of growth, then you miss that opportunity, and it's very difficult to penetrate these areas on a later date and time. And therefore, these are some of the new areas. But I wanted to specifically mention about the point which Anu made about manufacturing, that we came out with this production linked incentive just 2-3 months back. We launched it, and we are supporting mobile and electronic manufacturers who keep increasing their size and scale for the next 5 years. And we've seen all the manufacturers of Apple, Wistron, Pegatron, Foxconn, all getting into India. We've seen Samsung getting into India, in fact, relocating its manufacturing from China to India, as in the case of several other electronics manufacturers. So my view is that these are all sectors which we are identifying are all export oriented. So our objective really is to push for manufacturing led exports, which will be very critical for India.
James, let's come to you. In this geopolitical environment, tension between the US and China, reform possibly of supply chains, certainly review of supply chains. Is the opportunity for India more in the manufacturing space than the tech space?
Is that for me?
Yes, it's all of the above, isn't it?
Yeah.
No, for me, I think, Amitabh. So how to think about this? I always get a bit nervous when people start talking about leapfrogging, because one of the nice things about the McKinsey report is we go through and look at the details. Then AI isn't in there as a place where you get lots of jobs. It's tourism and food processing and construction and kind of boring, not very sexy sounding sectors. It's not machine learning and kind of data analytics that is going to get you 50 million jobs in sector X. So there is a danger when we begin to talk about, politicians like to talk about leapfrogging, because the notion that India could leap from kind of agriculture to services sounds great. But as Amitabh said, no country has ever really done this. And if you're imagining an Indian economy that has a productive services sector that everyone else is kind of living off, but no manufacturing, and that really looks like a kind of oil shake them, and it's not the kind of structure of an economy that you have any other real models for. That said, and this gets back to your question, underpinning all of these sectors, there is obviously a huge advantage, a huge kind of opportunity that India is, unlike China or South Korea, is developing these sectors in a way that can take advantage of these underpinning enabling technologies that in some senses can make them grow faster and make them more efficient. The geopolitics of this, I'll say this to close, is if you bring the services and the manufacturing together. Now, what I mean by this is one of India's opportunities is to be part of a kind of the sort of anti-China zone in a funny way, where people decide to locate in India because of geopolitical worries about China. And that's not just going to be about tech in the sense of TikTok or high-tech manufacturing, because an awful lot of things that need to be made in factories are going to get bound up in this geopolitical competition. And so Jayant Sinha, the former BJP minister, wrote about the kind of trusted trade and the fact that India will be wanting to trade with countries with whom it has trust. And so the fact that you have this coming together of manufacturing and high-tech services, the risk is that gets caught up in the geopolitical turmoil, but the opportunity, therefore, is that India can hoover up a lot of these kind of sectors that are going to move out of China because precisely of this kind of geopolitical problem. So that, I think, is a real opportunity for India, and it's great to hear Amitabh sort of talking about the government's enthusiasm to seize that opportunity, and also to have in the McKinsey report the kind of steps that are needed, still many reforms that are needed in order to begin to become the kind of place that is friendly to this kind of large-scale manufacturing. Of course, it can be done. I mean, I toured plenty of car factories when I lived in India. India is a fantastic place to make cars. It's becoming a fantastic place to make electronics. The question is, can it become a fantastic place to make everything else? And that's the challenge.
Great, thanks, James. I want to go to questions now. And first question to Lord Stephen Green, who is Chairman of Asia House. Stephen.
Michael, thank you. First of all, congratulations to Anu and McKinsey. I think it's a terrific report. I really enjoyed listening to it, and actually I have a question primarily aimed at you in a second. I just wanted to kind of reflect a bit on the extremely interesting conversation we've had just now, very briefly, to say that when you, I mean, I've never lived in India, but I've visited it countless times. When I was with HSBC, this was a regular port of call. Since I left HSBC, I was trade minister in the British government. It was a regular port of call. And I've always loved going there on holiday. The cultural expeditions around the richest and most fascinating culture in the world, for my money, are something you could spend the rest of your life doing. Anybody who knows India, even superficially, will know that there's an enormous mountain to climb in this whole endeavour, because it's not merely that the demographics are creating the sorts of numbers that you were wrestling with, the 90 million jobs. It is also, of course, that there's an embedded extreme levels of inefficiency, of over-manning in all sorts of sectors, which mean that the more efficient India gets in various sectors, the more it will create new labour absorption challenges as frankly, jobs are shed where they don't need to be. You don't need to be an economic expert. Casual observation will tell you that there's an enormous amount of over-manning all over the place in India. So this is a gigantic challenge. And it would be easy just to think thus far along my little line of reasoning and conclude with despair that India's never going to climb this mountain to any significant extent. But then you listen to the McKinsey report, and because it focuses on detail, all the 6 sectors, and I don't have it all in my mind, various rather specific measures that you could take, specific benchmarks. Particularly, I was fascinated by the benchmarking of the size, the company sizes vis-a-vis peers, and that tells you that there are a lot of specific interventions which, if they could only be done, would actually unleash a lot of growth. It may or may not help the labour absorption challenge, and for reasons I've just been articulating, I think it could, at least on a sort of J-curve basis, make it worse to begin with. but nevertheless, it's the right thing to do. My question, therefore, to Anu is, having put all of that work into that McKinsey report and bearing in mind the huge status or voice of authority that McKinsey is, what effort are you putting into, as it were, marketing the report around India? I mean, obviously, with Amitabh, you will have been talking, I'm sure, with Amitabh and his team very intensively. Have you managed to get to the Prime Minister, and what about the Prime Ministers of the states? And it just seems to me that you need to seize the moment to really create a dialogue in favour of reform. And India being what it is, that's at many levels, both at state and at federal, business, public administration, even the not-for-profit sector. Certainly, I don't know how you get to the kind of agricultural world, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the question. How are you taking this report into the public domain? Thank you.
So that's a great question. Thanks for that, Stephen. Before I answer it, I do want to touch upon your observation around job shedding and efficiency and the link between the two, because I think you put your finger on actually one of the biggest, if not the biggest, conceptual assumptions or arguments that's underlying this work, right? And our basic belief is, and this is based on what we've seen across multiple countries, across multiple eras of technological development, as well as looking at things at a sector level, for example. But our contention really is that the productivity growth that you see with efficiency is actually very key to sustaining the 1.5% or 2% job growth, or maybe 0.5% job growth for most advanced economies by now. But even to sustain whatever level of job growth you need, the productivity growth is actually, over a long period of time, pretty essential to that, because that's what keeps the activity competitive, and that's what enables, the labor to actually satisfy demand wherever it is. The big precondition for that is the problem, which is that this doesn't happen when disruptions are very rapid over short periods of time. And it doesn't happen when labor mobility, whether that's in terms of the skills mobility, education, occupational transitions that people need to make very rapidly as things change, or moving to places where jobs are available, like cities from where they are. If there are barriers to all these kinds of mobility, we will see labor markets not responding, and the kind of efficiency does not translate into job growth. But absent that, we think over long periods of time, the two need to go hand in hand. So that was just a reaction to, I think, the very important point you made.
And if I may just interrupt, I certainly agree that over the long term, this is not a contradiction in terms, but in the short term, it will be. So there is sort of a J curve that you have to run in various sectors to get this done.
Absolutely. And part of that is improving labor's ability to adjust. I would say part of that is probably also thinking about social support networks or social support safety nets, so to speak, right, to help tide over those shorter periods.
Yeah. And again, there are attempts, as you said, yeah. I'm sorry, I don't want to make this a conversation just between the two of us, but you did say quite rightly that there are templates around. No, sorry, it was James who said this. There are templates around about how to get this done, including that point. There are templates around. Yeah. Sorry, I will now shut up.
And I will come to your real question, which was the dialogue. I mean, in terms of how do we think we want to, it's not just about a report and putting it out there. We do want to, and we are attempting to, I think the first step is just to sensitize and make a lot of people aware about just the fact base, because one of our big contributions is pulling together a fact base. A lot of discussions happen without sort of well-grounded benchmarks and data, as you rightly said. So we are trying to disseminate this very actively, apart from the big broadcast pieces. Yes, at all significant levels in government, including the highest level. I have to say that across both the political establishment as well as the bureaucracy, people are very open at this point and want to engage and want to hear, and also in a characteristic Indian fashion, quite impatient to say, okay, we get all the analysis. What do you think we really need to do, right? So we are sort of at least having some doors and windows open to us to take some more steps in terms of specificity around what we think is the right way forward. And that's encouraging. I think we need to do a lot more at the states. So far, it's early days for us in this effort, but states are going to be quite key, at least 2 or 3 states. I know Amitabh has always told us, go talk to the states and cities, because that's where the action is, right? So we hope to get to that soon as well. And I think the third piece for us is we can't ignore the business side of things and corporate India, so to speak, right? And one of the things we do feel is critical in terms of our own mission as McKinsey in India, for example, is that we should have a role to play in helping such institutions grow up and be competitive. So this plays to our strengths as a consulting firm, and we understand the micro business of how firms can be more competitive. So that's an area we're also looking at to see what concerted responses we can help catalyze in India to actually help that segment.
Okay, thanks. I do want to go to questions, but James, you've got a quick comment on that, and then I'll go to Rana Hassan from the ADB, and after that, Stephen Kinder. But James, quick response from you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something about the kind of corporate India, which we glossed over. I think one of the best things in this report is this idea of larger companies. And I mean, this has been one of India's long-standing problems. Far too many small companies, hard for what Anu calls the missing middle to grow. But I think there's another tension here, which is worth keeping an eye on. So I'm imagining some of you have been enjoying the fantastic Netflix series, Bad Boys Billionaires India, which, given my Billionaire Raj book, I've been enjoying. And I think there's still this tension in India between the government finding ways to support larger companies versus supporting large companies that are like the real big boys. And you do see, I think, a kind of continued drift in India towards a kind of certain sort of kind of help to monopolies is most obvious in telecoms, but Amitabh mentioned the airport privatization, which was snapped up by various of the big tycoons. And so I think having policies which support the growth of this kind of missing middle, fast frontier companies, helping them grow into new areas and new businesses, market friendly, but that's terrific. That's exactly what India needs. But India does still have to guard against these policies which are really helping large established incumbents. And that does have a kind of geopolitical tinge. I mean, you look at what's happening with Reliance Jio at the moment, and effectively the government has said, we're going to support creating a national technology champion. That has some advantages. If you're a poorer Indian consumer, you are now getting much faster internet, much more cheaply. But it has long-term problems in terms of competitiveness. So this is a very difficult balance that the government needs to strike, I think. And it gets also into the question of the banking system and still what needs to be done to put more capital into the banks and sort of clean up the problems of bad debt. So I just wanted to highlight that because I think it's one of the most important parts of this McKinsey report and one of the most difficult challenges for India to kind of move beyond this heritage of kind of dysfunctional banking and crony capitalism and towards a system of kind of fully competitive markets, which it has in some sectors, but not all. So.
Okay, great, thanks. Let's go to Rana Hassan from ADB, and after that, Stephen Kinder from Shell. Rana.
Thank you, Michael. I've really enjoyed the presentation by Anu and the remarks by Mr. Kant and James. A couple of observations and questions. First, just on this issue of the small becoming medium, the medium becoming large. Anu, in this one, how confident are you that the small can get to medium? You know, in my sense, these very small guys are very difficult to help, and oftentimes what we've seen is it's really big players who've been in trading, etc., and they come up and they set up large manufacturing shops. So in a sense, finding these gazelles, as it's called in the literature, is really very difficult. And in that sense, I think the point Mr. Kant was making on the FDI coming in, that's a really positive story, because I'm just not so confident that you're going to get this small to get to the medium. You really need fresh, large players just coming in. The second thing I'd like to just point out is about location. And I think Mr. Kant put it very nicely that, you know, you've got the center and you've got the states, and it's 10 states where there's a lot of action. And I would go even further. You know, when we were looking at some of this data, it's a bit dated, but I think it's the best data that's out there from the economic census. What's interesting is if you look at manufacturing firms with 50 or more workers, 20% of manufacturing employment is actually just in 7 districts. 50% of manufacturing employment is in 36 districts. So in a sense, the problem should be even simpler to solve, because you don't have to go around fixing the whole country. You need to focus on these districts. And that's where I guess my question is both to Anu and Mr. Kant. When we look at some of the countries in East Asia, the structure of governance actually helps them in the following way, that city mayors, city officials are very powerful. And city officials are incentivized to get those firms there. They're incentivized to actually make sure that the problems that the firm faces are dealt with, the problems workers face are dealt with. But in India, we don't have a natural mechanism, because the city officials, the local officials, they just don't have that many degrees of freedom. And so I think in part of this whole process of improving the ease of business, it's somehow important to bring these local officials really working closely with the different state agencies. So it's really, again, a challenge at the state level, but that's something I'd love to hear your thoughts or Mr. Kant's thoughts on that locational aspect.
Rana, thank you very much. Amitabh, let's start with you, the locational. Is this a city official issue as well?
I'm a believer in the Indian context that it's states which are drivers of growth. And therefore, you need to identify a few states. But the other key challenge for India is to urbanize rapidly. And urbanization, as has been seen in other parts of the world, can be a very major driver of growth and job creation. And in India's case, there's been a lot of unplanned, unsustainable urbanization. It's only now for the first time that we've got into these 100 smart cities. We are doing 50 metros and a lot of corridor projects, etc. So they will automatically throw up a lot of opportunities for good urbanization, and that will be again a very key factor of growth. But there are 2 points I want to make. One is that Atmanirbhar Bharat, when the Prime Minister talked about it, is not about protectionism. It's about using domestic demand to become a global player. It's about penetrating global value chains. That's important to understand. And second is that we are very open economy as far as foreign direct investment is concerned. We are amongst the top recipients of FDI, and we've opened up very vigorously to FDI regime. And the last point I want to make is that India is a very vibrant and a very dynamic startup ecosystem. And these startups, actually, we've been able to create the second best ecosystem in the world for startups. And many of them are disrupting sectors after sectors in a very big way, including areas like e-commerce, etc. So they will make a huge impact. But eventually, the ability of India to be able to grow on a sustained basis over a long period of time is a function of how cost competitive you are, and that will be a function of your size and scale. So the size and scale of manufacturing will be very, very important. As Rana said, a lot of our units are still either medium or small, and many of them are micro. So the ability to do large scale manufacturing is very critical, and I think that is still in several areas. Now that labor laws have been totally restructured, now that you've had major reforms in agriculture sector, which opens the possibility of contract farming, there's a huge possibility of doing large-scale food processing, doing large-scale manufacturing in India. And this is an opportunity. This is a huge, huge opportunity for India.
Anu, your comments on Rana's question.
So 2 questions. Let's start with the locational question. I think as Amitabh said, it's the chief ministers who play that role of the city mayors, and admittedly they are one level above, so they are not as empowered, close to business as a city mayor would be. But from where we are, if a set of chief ministers actually exercised what they needed to do and in our view, thought about their states in a very localized way. So exactly your point, Rana, which is it's the districts that matter. So we've illustrated some maps for Maharashtra, of Uttar Pradesh, of Odisha in the report. And we've said that if you think about all the frontier businesses and you look at the natural endowments as well as the labor and skills pool available, to your point, right, very few districts actually have manufacturing labor today. So if you look at that, we've sort of overlaid the business opportunities on the districts for these 3 states. And it turns out that in a state, if there are 35 districts, there are probably 8 or 10 of them which really have potential across that spectrum of services, agricultural value add, and manufacturing led growth. And what chief ministers really need to do is create the right architecture to empower those 8 districts, right? And very much sort of going more decentralized, maybe not cities. And the reason we didn't take the city lens is we want ideas that can be implemented in a relatively short period of time, and really empowering the cities with funding, etc. I think is a longer term reform agenda that might even touch, constitutional reform and all of that. So important, but you can do a lot even with the state structure that we have today, is our sense. And on the companies, I think that was a great point you made. I should clarify that the potential to scale up, our view was not so much about which are the companies that are going to scale up. We looked at it sector by sector. We did find that very fragmented sectors like construction, healthcare, retail trade, or even food processing, highly fragmented, lots of scope for companies to scale up. Which sort of companies? It's going to be a mix of existing ones as well as the new ones, which perhaps don't even exist today. So there could be these hyper growths. Maybe FDI has a lot of role to play there. But our bigger point was it can't be just looking to the existing cohort of 600 large firms and saying, you guys have to scale up. They have to scale up, but they have to be also, in a way, dislodged and competed against by this upward pressure that comes from either completely new companies or existing smaller companies scaling up.
Okay, thanks. Look, we've got just under 10 minutes left and we've got lots of questions, so let's see if we can rattle through some of them pretty quickly. Stephen Kinder from Shell, and after that, Sachin Kumar from Arup. But Stephen.
Hi, it's Stephen Kinder here from Shell. I'm on the chemical side, and I look at large or very large scale petrochemical investments around the world and have been investigating India the last couple of years. So a lot of the comments resonate very well from my observations. Again, in many sectors, a few large dominating companies, a large number of smaller companies. But the key really for us is, as we look at an investment in a country like India, is how does that next generation of medium companies develop, and what are the key steps to enable that, and what could a company like Shell do to help enable that? Thank you.
Anu, let's start with you.
I think that's a great question. I think there are 2 aspects to it. One is we have seen that it's not so much about liberalizing FDI caps in many of these sectors, because that has already happened. And notwithstanding that, the flow of actual FDI, bar a few areas which have been obviously very high growth. So the digital and IT services space has seen a lot of FDI, but some of the core sectors like chemicals, for example, or petchem might not have. So it is about going back to the doing business, ease of doing business environment, and really radically simplifying that on the ground for smaller companies, or for everybody, but it will benefit smaller companies. And that actually will enable more of the FDI to flow in even within what's allowed. That's one piece. And then the thought about what larger companies could do, we weren't able to sort of solve this analytically, but it's my sense that there is a lot more of investing within their own ecosystems to strengthen whether the supplier base or the downstream chain, right? The retail chain, sector by sector. There are opportunities for larger companies to step up and do more. We've seen good examples of that happening in things like vendor financing, where banks have played a role, and the smaller companies are linked to the larger companies and benefit from their presence. But there's a long way to go in terms of other best practices or other forms of support that larger companies can do. It's an area we want to investigate clearly, because we do work with many of the large companies.
Amitabh, let's put that to you. What can large companies do to help push this through?
you can't have MSMEs growing and prospering without large companies. There's a backward forward linkage in the ecosystem between large companies and small companies. And therefore, there's plenty that Shell can do to make MSMEs integrate and grow. But one of the key challenges for India is that the private debt to GDP ratio, I'm not talking about the government debt, but the private debt to GDP ratio in India is extremely low as compared to other countries of the world. In fact, it has ballooned in other countries of the world, but in India, there's been a lot of fiscal discipline. There's excessive degree of fiscal discipline by the financial institution. They're extremely shy of lending actually to the MSME sector. But now that a huge amount of digitization has taken place, there's credit history, and you are able to find out as to who your borrowers, what has been their financial discipline. I think a lot of more credit should really flow to the private sector, and this will enable MSME to grow in a bigger way in the years to come.
Okay, Sachin Kumar from Arup, and then we'll go to Lord Billamoria. Sachin.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I just want to make a couple of very small points. One is around our commitment to climate action plan. I know we've been talking about economy and the growth and what we want to achieve going forward, but what impact would things like city resilience will make on that aspiration or ambition to achieve the kind of growth we are looking to achieve? Give you a small example around C40 cities where major cities from India like Chennai, Delhi, and Kolkata, who signed up for the climate action, but they've been primarily non-responsive so far. So I just want to take perhaps Amitabh's view on that. The second aspect was more around the sector. I agree with James' view that the growth probably will be underpinned by that from or by the traditional sector, and more so if you start looking at upskilling the labor and improving the efficiencies in like manufacturing and construction industry. So what India is doing to embrace that going forward? We have a lot of work happening in India around infrastructure, but I can still see a lot of inefficiency that has come into play, and which means again could be linked to the climate action plan, and also the carbon in the infrastructure and so on and so forth. So perhaps to link the point, maybe if you can comment on that, please.
Amitabh, let's start with you.
So we've taken a series of measures. Our commitment to climate change is pretty enormous. The Prime Minister had committed to 175 gigawatt by 2022. We've already achieved close to about 90 gigawatt of solar power, all through private sector initiative. We've put out competitive bids, and we've got the lowest price bids in the world. The target has now been scaled up to 450 gigawatt by 2030, which includes a huge drive for both solar and wind. We moved away in a very big way from fossil fuel, and actually in the last couple of years we've not had any new thermal power, simply because the price of solar power has fallen so radically in India that it's become far more competitive to do solar power than thermal power. And now that we are pushing for electric mobility, the challenge for India is that there's a huge advantage of not having legacy issues, because we only have about 22 cars per 1,000 people as compared to 950 cars per 1,000 people in America and about 880 cars per 1,000 people in Europe. So as we drive the electric mobility movement, we will not have to destroy a lot of established cars, internal combustion cars. And therefore, there's a huge push for public transportation and two-wheelers and three-wheelers, which are all electric. The government is supporting it through a differential goods and services tax regime. And I think these are areas where a lot of work has been done in India.
Okay, James, I think Sachin referred to your comments on manufacturing being actually the key to growth of jobs much more than digital.
And I suppose I'd agree with that, and I'd echo what Rana Hassan said about the focus needing to be on taking big-ish companies and making them bigger as opposed to thinking you're going to be able to take tiny companies and turn them into big companies. I just echo really the first comment that was made about climate change. I think it's an important thing to mention. The Modi government's policy on climate and energy has actually been in some ways really quite progressive, particularly on solar. But if you're thinking about the broader context of India's growth over the next decade or two, zoom up to the really big picture, then it's pretty clear that climate is going to be a big challenge for India's globalization, that there will be climate-related pressures on trade and investment, and that India's kind of vulnerability on climate is going to make a lot of the tasks that Anu has outlined much harder. And indeed, McKinsey, MGI have done some great work on climate and the kind of challenges that this presents. So I think it's hard to suggest that the climate crisis is an opportunity for India. I just think it is going to make everything harder, but it is important that we talk about it. And I think that we sit rather kind of precariously in the pandemic, because there certainly is some ways in which the pandemic is going to make the climate transition harder. There's going to be less money to go around. Priorities are going to go into places that need them immediately, not in sort of 15 or 20 years' time. But as Amitabh says, actually it can looked at potentially more positively, be an accelerant to this transition. And so it's definitely good to hear the Indian government talking about both its successes on solar and the fact that it's going to kind of continue to push in these areas, because if you don't get this climate transition right, then that's going to be a major drag on the kind of job creating industries that Anu was talking about in her report. So it really should be front and center now in these kind of conversations. Indeed, I should have mentioned it myself. So.
Great, thanks, James. Final question, Lord Billamoria.
Thank you very much. And Amitabh, great to see you. James, you as well. And Anu, thanks for that great report. What stood out for me in your presentation, Anu, was the whole huge opportunity for the gazelle companies, the growth companies, the middle market companies. Amitabh, have you considered in India to have a sort of 3 eyes, what we call the 3 eyes model here, that was formed after the Second World War? There was a report released yesterday called From Survive to Thrive, where we have suggested, and as president of the CBI, I contributed to it, that the government actually puts in money into companies that can invest around the regions, and you bring in private sector money as well and identify the growth companies. In the UK, there are 21,400 of them, 1/3 in London, 2/3 spread around the UK. And if you can power those companies, you'll not only help them survive after a crisis, but help them to grow. But it needs government and the private sector working together. Is there such an initiative in India? And if not, I think there's a great opportunity for it.
So, Karan, that's an excellent question. There are different challenges in India, one of which was the challenge during the COVID period of livelihood. And a lot has been done for that. But simultaneously, the government has taken a series of measures, both fiscal and monetary measures were taken to assist and support the private sector in India. So the important thing at this point of time is to ensure that for the Indian economy, rather than look around the region, to ensure that Indian companies which are very deeply stressed are taken care of, particularly in sectors, in a vast range of sectors like tourism, real estate, etc., which are major job creators. And therefore, the package which the government came out was essentially looking at Indian companies at this point of time, which is very important rather than the region. But over a longer period of time, what you're saying, we need to look at that.
Final word to you, Anu. Is that the sort of initiative that the Indian government should be looking at?
I think it's interesting, but from what at least we've seen, it's particularly this government is very keen to do things on an arm's length basis vis-a-vis companies. And one of the implications of that, potentially a stumbling block, if you think about it that way, is that it is hard to pick and choose which companies to support, right? It has to be very dependent on a formula or some kind of formulaic approach. And what we've also observed is that the government finds it relatively easy to justify stepping in, as Amitabh said, when you're talking about companies at the very small end. So what they've done for the MSMEs, that goes up to maybe about $5 or $10 million of revenue, but it doesn't really get to the maybe $300 to $500 million company, and how do you support that company to scale up even further? I think that genuinely is hard to do within the political economy and other constraints of propriety and arm's length, et cetera, that the government is operating currently. And I think it's a very interesting challenge, actually, to think about what might be a more rule-based way to do this, as opposed to striking deals with companies you like.
Anu, thanks very much. And thank you all very much. We, I'm afraid, need to leave it there. In fact, we have run slightly over time. What a fascinating conversation. Just remains for me to thank our speakers, James Crabtree, Amitabh Kant, and of course, Anu Madgavkar. Thank you and congratulations on what is a fantastic report. I'm sure we'll hear much more about it as we go forward. Thank you all for joining us. Thanks for your questions and engagement. Really good to see you. Hope everybody is safe and well and stays that way. And we'll see you at Asia House again very, very soon. Take care, everyone. Bye for now.